All right, we're going to be starting a new unit that's going to deal with macromolecules and enzymes. The first learning target we're going to be covering is that students will be able to describe the structure and function of the four major macromolecules and provide examples of each. So, structure, kind of what it looks like, function, what it does, of the four major macromolecules, and then also to provide examples of each kind. First of all, though, we have to look at what we mean by a macromolecule. Macro, that little word fragment means big. Okay, so it's a large molecule. A macromolecule here is many organic molecules joined together. An organic molecule is any molecule that contains carbon-hydrogen bonds. Okay, so you're going to see in the different macromolecules that we look at that all of them contain the elements carbon and hydrogen. And so once we have that macromolecule, once we've joined all these molecules together, we form what's known as a polymer. Poly, right here, means many. A monomer is just a single unit. Mono means one. And so a monomer, another name for that monomer might be like a subunit. So when we're talking about these macromolecules, they are all large molecules that are made up of many, many subunits or monomers. And so we're going to break down and look at each one of these to see what are these large molecules, what are their monomers, what are their structures and functions. And the four main categories of macromolecules are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. We're going to cover these first two in this PowerPoint, and then we'll cover the next two in a subsequent PowerPoint. Carbohydrates, they are your main source of energy, and they are short-term energy. I should have had that included in there. So they're kind of your quick source of energy. They're made up of three elements: carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So just remember CHO. CHO, CHO, CHO. Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. The main subunit, remember that's what a monomer is a subunit, is a saccharide or a sugar. Sometimes it's known as a simple sugar. Okay? We can divide the different examples of carbohydrates into three basic categories. One that we call monosaccharides. That means it's a single sugar. A disaccharide. Di stands for two, so it's a double sugar. And polysaccharide. Poly stands for many. So that's made up of many of those saccharides or sugar subunits. And if you look at the diagrams here, you can see here is this single ring structure here of a 6-carbon sugar. Here is a double ring structure. And here we have many of these ring structures. See all these here, okay? So monosaccharide, disaccharide, and polysaccharide. Okay, so as we're looking at these, some examples of a monosaccharide include glucose. That's your what we call your blood sugar. Okay, that's what flows around in your blood and provides energy for your body, and that comes from the carbohydrates that you eat. Sucrose is your baking sugar, like what you might put in when you're baking something, or maybe you sprinkle it on your cereal or add it to coffee or something. That's sucrose, and that's a disaccharide. Your polysaccharides include starch, which is found in plants. So if you think of any of those starchy foods that you eat, like potatoes and rice, and like bread and pasta come from your grains, like wheat, that are very starchy. So that's stored in plants as starch. That's that polysaccharide. Glycogen, that's how we store our carbohydrates, in the form of glycogen in our liver. And so that's more of a polysaccharide. And then cellulose, it makes up the cell walls of plant cells. If you've ever eaten celery and gotten the little string things like caught in your teeth, well, that tough outer coating of the cell wall of a plant is cellulose. And we can't digest that. So that just kind of goes right through you. So those are examples of polysaccharides. So you need to make sure you know the function, the elements that are found in carbohydrates, what the monomer or subunit is, as well as these examples. Now let's take a closer look at glycogen. Why is that so important? Well, this is what's going to help give you a ready supply of energy when you start running low on your blood sugar. It's stored in your liver, and when your blood sugar gets low, so when your levels of glucose that are flowing around in your bloodstream get low, then your pancreas is going to release what's called glucagon. That's a hormone that's going to attach to receptor proteins in your liver, and it's going to help your liver break down that glycogen, and it's going to release glucose into your bloodstream. And now you have that quick energy again that you need to do your different daily activities. Lipids also are a form of energy, stored energy, but they are your long-term energy source, whereas your carbohydrates are more of your quick energy and short-term energy source. And most of that is stored as fat on your body. As you notice, we still have the elements C, H, and O that make up lipids. So again, remember CHO as part of your trying to remember what elements are found there. Now, lipids are kind of unusual in that they are not made up of particular monomers like our other macromolecules are, but fats in particular, fats are made up of subunits. They are made up of one glycerol molecule and 3 fatty acid chains. And so if you look at it down below, this right here would be your glycerol molecule, and these would be your 3 fatty acid chains that would be found there. Okay, so they're not true polymers in that they have these monomers except for a fat molecule. And the fats have 1 glycerol and 3 fatty acid chains. Now, lipids are nonpolar, so they repel water. So they're not going to mix together with water, but they can mix together with oil. If you ever think of Italian dressing and you shake it up, if you let it sit for a while, the oil will separate from the water in that dressing. Some examples of lipids include fats, which we've already talked about, but they also include steroids and waxes. Well, you have wax in your body, your earwax, so that would be an example of a lipid. Because lipids have more carbon-hydrogen bonds in those long chains, they actually have more energy in fat than in carbohydrates. I should say than. Okay? And again, we store our lipids as fat and to use as an energy source. That's after all your glycogen in your liver has been broken down to use your quick energy source with glucose. Then we switch to our lipids and use our fat as an energy source. Now we can break lipids, specifically the fats of lipids, into 2 different types. Your saturated fats and your unsaturated fats. If something is saturated, it means it's totally coated. It's totally coated with something. And so in this case, we're talking about a fat being saturated with hydrogen. And so if you look here, you can see all of these hydrogens attached to the carbons. So it's totally saturated. Every single one of them is covered with a hydrogen atom there. These saturated fats are solids at room temperature. They all have single bonds. That's what makes them be saturated with those hydrogens. So a good example of that would be butter is a good example. Now, an unsaturated fat is not totally covered, and that's because they contain double bonds. See this double bond right here between the carbons? That means that these carbons can no longer bond to hydrogens, which means now they are no longer saturated like they were up here. They are unsaturated. And so unsaturated fats are liquids at room temperature, and so things like your oils here would be an example of an unsaturated fat. So let's do a little bit of practice here of comparing and contrasting carbohydrates and lipids. Remember, if we're going to compare something, that is how it's the same. If we're contrasting, we're trying to look at how is it different. Okay, so one of the things, if you remember, is if we look at the elements, what were you supposed to remember for both carbohydrates and lipids? Cho, cho, cho. Okay, so they both have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. All right. They both have energy storage, right? They're both an energy source. Okay, so the difference, though, is this is your short-term energy with carbohydrates, and this is long-term energy with your lipids. Now, a carbohydrate, what was the subunit again? They have saccharides, also known as simple sugars. And lipids, specifically fat, that's the only one we can talk about, has 1 glycerol and 3 fatty acid chains. Okay. And what were some examples of carbohydrates again? Remember, you can have glucose, sucrose, glycogen, we talked about, cellulose. Okay, so lots of examples of carbohydrates. For lipids, remember it was fat was one of them, and also steroids and waxes. All of those are included with the lipids. So again, always make sure you know the elements that are found in both. And I'll just fill that in just so I have it, but just, you know, that's one way that they're both the same, is that they both have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Know the elements, know the function, subunits, and examples.